Okay, well, very nice to have you all back here. I was told we must stop on time, so we don't have quite as much time as we thought. We've got here 4 women who have worked or are working at the LMB. We initially had only alumni, but then we figured enough already of us old folks, and let's have some young ones here because we don't want to continue looking back. And in fact, we will do both, look back, look at now, and look into the future. So we had a little discussion a couple of weeks ago or so. There are, of course, many things that come up in such discussion: kids, discrimination, lack of female networks. So we'll be doing a little bit at back then and now. And of course, we heard a lot of back then from the fantastic speakers in the last couple of days. There's one thing I noticed. They're all brave. They were all scared. And there was something else. There was something we all had in common. And it was really amazing. They're all aspiring now. And then we'll look a little bit about the future because we've made progress between then and now. We just see it by the numbers. But there is further progress to be made. And we'll be hearing from my wonderful colleagues here. So we'll start by having everyone say a little bit about themselves and about what was their biggest challenge in their career. So we'll go through them. I'll then say one little thing myself at the end. So Ruth, you please start.
So I was born in Israel, did my undergraduate studies at Hebrew University. I started with chemistry and physics and second degree in physical chemistry. And then I thought that biological questions are more interesting to me. So I moved for my PhD to the Weizmann Institute, where I did my PhD on biophysics of proteins. I was married during my bachelor degrees, and my husband was also studying in chemistry. So we both were doing our PhD at the Weizmann Institute. And then we were looking for a postdoc position, and it was clear we were going to the same place. And I was interested in relationship between structure and function and assembly of large biological molecules. And so I decided to go to the LMB with Aaron Klug. So this was 1971. Before that, I wrote to Aaron, and he accepted me. And then my husband wrote to Brian Hartley, and he was accepted. And so we moved with our 2-old-year daughter. And so I knew it is going to be difficult because not only because of moving, but also because of the language problem. So we came with an au pair girl with us. And the first year it worked, but then she was homesick. And then I faced several problems with looking for a care for the daughter. And finally, we got a wonderful solution. She was going in the morning to kindergarten, and in the afternoon, their next door neighbor were a wonderful, nice couple, and they were looking after her. And I paid, of course, but they treated her like their granddaughter. So this was a good solution. So for this part, work at LMB, this was a wonderful period, 2 wonderful, wonderful years. Very stimulating. The lab was not big as here. Wonderful talks that we had these 2 days. But the interaction and the stimulation, and especially working with Aaron, I was really fortunate. And I also got a lot of help. I learned microscopy with John Finch, and Linda Amos was so kind and was helping me in the structural studies. My project was assembly and structure, 3-dimensional reconstruction of a strain of TMV dalamense. So this was 2 wonderful years. And we have many friends, still friendship that continue today. And most stimulated period, and the feeling was that the sky is the limit. And the lab lectures in October were really wonderful, and the interaction with people was really wonderful. So after that, we went back to Israel. I had my own lab, and I was working on, I decided here, because Francis King was talking about the structure of chromatin, I decided that I was interested in assembly system. So I decided I will continue with chromatin, and the histone looked to me a wonderful assembly system. And so coming back to Israel, that was my project, histone assembly and chromatin. And I collaborated with Michael Bustin, who was the Weizmann, and he had a wonderful set of antibodies. And so I had some slides.
Do you want to tell us about your major challenge?
Yes. And just I wanted to mention another thing is that when splicing was discovered, and then my husband and me, we moved to working on splicing after a sabbatical at Stanford, and this was my main project. And that's it. And the challenges, we all face challenges, and it was clear to me that science is my passion, and I'm going to, and in our family, we were equal so all the way. And so there was no consideration who is going to do it together. And so the challenges you face, I think, all of you face. And,
well,
but if you have the passion, then you work hard, and you can do it.
I think that's very interesting, and I think we'll see national differences there. And obviously, Israel is a bit different. She has a microphone. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marta. I'm a PI here at the LMB, and I moved to Cambridge in 2014 to join the lab of Magdalena Zernica-Getz. But I'm going to focus specifically on my transition from postdoc to PI. I started looking for PI positions in 2018, and I perfectly remember February 2019, Sean called me and he said, "You have a position." And I was so excited, I couldn't believe it. And then 2 days later, I take a pregnancy test and it's positive. And I was even more surprised because I had been trying for 2 years. So, I mean, my life was just gonna change completely. I was gonna be a PI and I was gonna be a mother. And so I decided to postpone my start at the LMB to have maternity leave before actually being a PI. The only slight issue was that I was an EMBO advanced fellow, which meant I didn't have a contract, which meant I didn't have maternity leave from the government. But luckily enough, EMBO gave me 3 months, which was actually enough because I really wanted to go back to the lab. But the way the system works in this country, if fathers want to take more than 2 weeks, they need to get the leave from the mothers share, but I had nothing to share. So my husband couldn't take any leave. And so what do you do in that situation? You have a 3-month-old daughter and you are starting your own group at the LMB. And so coming from Spain, what you do is you call your mother. So my grandmother came to help us. She retired and she moved with us to take care of my daughter. This was February 2020. In March 2020, the LMB closed. So I went back home and I remember perfectly Boris Johnson saying on TV, "Be ready to lose your loved ones. We will go for herd immunity." And my mom said, "Bye. I'm going." So by then, my husband was working in the hospital. So that meant I was a group leader at the LMB, but now I was a full-time mom at home with my daughter. So how are you a full-time scientist and a full-time mom? You just cannot. It's impossible. So I said, I thought I just have to make the most out of this time, enjoy the extra months that I got with my daughter. Whenever she's sleeping or when my husband comes home, I will be able to work. And so at the end, of course, it's a constant struggle. And I think the most important thing I learned is that you just need to have support. Support from your husband, from your family, from your friends, from institutions, funding bodies. This is the only way for us to go forward.
Thank you. Very good. Super. See, everybody's different. Liz.
So I'm Liz Miller and I'm a group leader here at the LMB. My lab studies protein folding and protein secretion and the interplay between those two processes. So those of you who heard Liz Blackburn's talk, my career has been a countercurrent to hers. She traveled east to west, I've traveled west to east. So I did my PhD in Australia and then did a postdoc in Randy Sheckman's lab at UC Berkeley, which was a fantastic time. Then took a faculty position at Columbia University, where I was for 10 years, and got tenure there. And then was recruited to the LMB about 7 years ago, where I run a group now. And so I sort of wanted to take a little bit of a different tack and examine my unexamined privilege that has helped me get to where I am. And so I had a solidly middle-class upbringing, which means that I could always count on the financial support of my parents. When I was a PhD student and couldn't afford my car insurance, they paid for it. So this greases the wheels very well that other people who are less privileged don't have. I came from an academic family. So my dad was a maths professor. And in fact, he ended up in Australia because he took a position from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton and emigrated to Australia when I was 3 years old. And so I knew what it was to have an intellectual pursuit as a career path, and that was a viable and in fact, highly desired intellectual endeavor, and that you can uproot your family and take them away from your extended family and still have a fantastic life wherever you end up. And so I didn't intend to never go back to Australia, and yet we haven't. So it's been 20 years, more than 20 years since we left Australia. And we really intended to go back after a 3-year postdoc, but then there were just more opportunities in other countries. And we could talk at length about the scientific opportunities in different countries. But there were opportunities available to me through my scientific pedigree, which opened doors, my ability to leave my family behind in Australia, my extended family behind in Australia, which also opened doors. And the support of my husband, who has been a trailing spouse for 2 career moves, and who looked after our son when I was coming up for tenure and needed to be giving talks and working in the lab and all of that stuff. So without that support, the success that I've had also wouldn't have been quite as possible. And so that's not to say all of that, that privilege has been great and has helped my career. But I would say that I've still faced institutional biases. And this is where I think moving forward is something that we need to think about, and especially senior women who are in positions of power to make change. When I was given tenure at Columbia, when I was awarded tenure at Columbia, I was the first woman tenured from within that department in 35 years. And that tells you that there's structural problems and that needs to be addressed, even in 2020. So that's all I'll say for now. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yanlan.
So I'm Yanlan. I'm now at UCL. I work at the LMCB, and I was a PhD student here from 04 to 08. And so I've tried to kind of, and then after that, I went to the LRI in London to do my postdoc, and then I moved to UCL. So trying to remember that geography, not many arrow moves, because that kind of comes up later on. So in terms of trying to think about the challenges I face, I think I summarize it really as the main thing, which is about trying to make compromises. So I think all of our career choices, and this is not limited just to being a woman per se, it's really everyone, I think. But maybe sometimes that reflects more on women than others, this kind of compromise. And you mentioned this kind of the partner sometimes compromising, vice versa. I think that's so my husband now, he's not a scientist, so we really had to think about, okay, who is the driver of the where do you establish your career? And so in science, as we were often said, oh, you have to move countries, you have to go to the States and come back, right? But I decided not to do it, which at the time I thought was a compromise and kind of a challenge I had to think about, because he's trained as an architect and very much UK based, and so for him would have been complete killer to his career, whereas for me moving to London wasn't so bad and actually has proven to be pretty good. And so that was one kind of challenge, just kind of mobility or lack of mobility or whatever you want to call it. This kind of perceived, oh, you must move countries, but in fact, you don't have to. And I'm one example, and there are many others who are examples, I think, that you can do well if you choose the right places for the science, not for the geography per se, right? So that's one thing. And another, which, honestly, we were, you laugh, but, if you heard the same, you must go away and then come back. And then another challenge, I think, although to be honest, most of my career has been pretty straightforward, I would say, but another big challenge really only became obvious when I had children, exactly like what I think everyone here who has kids or any caring duty, I don't want to call it children per se, but any caring duty or any health duty or whatever, any health issues, that means that you cannot control your time as much as you'd like to, right? So as a student, as a postdoc, you really could just focus on the science, at least I felt I could. And I think there was a statement earlier, focus on the science and everything else will take care of itself, which is true to a certain extent until you cannot just focus on the science, right? Which is when, for me, was really when I had children, and I had two, and one a year after I started my lab, and then another one just before the pandemic. So, suddenly you realize you have to share your time with two young kids, but also a new family, your scientific family, right? And so again, trying to build a lab, trying to share your time between this new science family, who you have to be responsible for, and the new biological family. And so that was, as everyone has said, that was a real shock to me, that suddenly I can't just work whenever I want, wherever I want. I really, but then also I didn't want to either, because there's a reason you have children, you want to spend time with them. There's a reason you have a lab and students and postdocs, because you also want to share your time with them and make sure they do the best that they possibly can. And so that, I think those two are the main things, but that's also about compromising. It's all about, how do you choose to, spend your time? And again, I think it's not limited to women, but perhaps as women, we may be sometimes more selfless, perhaps, with our time. And as a result, that can bring extra challenges that maybe other, don't. But again, I think it's really not limited just to being women with challenges.
Good. So some interesting statements. Shall we focus on some of the points we discussed? Something that kids have come up. So I do have two kids. For me, the challenge was actually also getting pregnant, because my husband was here at the Bayram Institute, whereas I was in Tübingen. If you have a very regular period and the right day is the Wednesday. So anyway, we somehow managed, I think, because of Christmas. But then the challenge was to look after two kids with one parent here, one in Tübingen, and no daycare, Bayram daycare.
Yeah.
So I think daycare, I had to start kindergarten at the Max Planck so in addition to having children, I also had to build a kindergarten for other people's children. That's now better. So some things are better. I think we've heard a lot about kids. Discrimination. None of you have mentioned discrimination, and I never knowingly experienced discrimination. Nor did I think it existed. I was at a girls' school, and there was never a question of being able to do something better or less good than the boys, because there were no boys. I think that was helpful. I never knowingly experienced discrimination. We heard from many of the stars here that they were just dumb on that ear and didn't listen if they heard it. What about you guys? Any known, is there, about you, about others?
Well,
has it changed?
I mean, I genuinely think that the fact that no female was tenured from within the department that I was at Columbia for 35 years is definitely evidence of discrimination.
Yes.
I'm sure it's not overt. My colleagues were fantastic and always very supportive. And yet that's why I call it institutional bias, because clearly there's a problem.
Yeah, there's clearly a problem. There's clearly an unconscious bias, or was an unconscious bias. But nobody comes up with an I mean, I reported the other day that I've seen it actually only once in my life. Somebody, and a very, very kind man, said of a candidate, a professorial candidate, who was French, living in Germany, single mother, member of parent-teacher organization for her daughters in her daughter's school, leading a lab, having moved around, mobile. And the person said, "This is a very good job. I don't think she'll have the strength. A single mother woman will have the strength to do it." I thought, you wimp, you've never had to do anything in your life. He said that. So they, at that time, this was in the 90s, they were still able to say that. Now they might still think it. But none of you have come across him.
Well, I've been in a meeting when I've heard someone saying, "Oh, that's just another pretty girl giving a talk," which of course is obviously not right, but it's happening these days. This was.
So it is still there.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, totally. I mean,
yes.
I totally
But
agree.
we would hear, that's why I'm also asking about others. So I would not know what has been said about me in jobs that I didn't get, of which there were a couple. But you're right, you're right. We have survivor bias here, absolutely. But we would have heard it about others, as we just heard. Ruth.
Maybe John was a committee of the National Academy, but maybe you can tell about that.
Oh, I mean, I can tell you my own story, the way I got to Jim Watson's lab, okay, 1960s. Everybody said to me, I'd been planning to go to medical school. I changed my mind later after I went to football, it was absolutely wonderful, but everybody said.
Yep.
And then after I switched to the PhD program and had my first year, I wanted to continue on with something that I didn't be familiar with the Ball's lab, and I was a very well-renowned Harvard professor, and said I wanted to work in his lab. He said, "But you're a woman, you get married and have kids. What good will it be?"
Yep.
And Jim Watson said, and it was the best thing that ever.
Right, whereas we do know what he says sometimes. Yeah.
But,
yeah,
it was-
yeah,
that was what he
yeah,
said.
yeah.
Everyone
So I
was
think,
right and
yeah,
left
yeah.
that this wasn't appropriate.
Yes,
I can,
So, yeah.
maybe I can tell the story that I told you. That after John gave the talk, and people in my university were interested in this, the decision of the committee. And you sent me your presentation, and I was giving it to different faculties in my university. And one of the faculties, the dean, he was really interested in promoting females. So I was giving this talk, and at the end, I said, why in my university there was no female dean until now? Since then, there were female deans. So he asked me, what about other institutions in Israel? So I said, yes, and I mentioned other universities and the Weizmann that they have female deans. And then he said to me, you know, but their faculty are small. So I looked at him, did you hear what you said?
So it's clear it used to exist. It may still be exist. Yes, in a moment. I'll give one example that things are in fact changing. So I was the EMBO director for 12 years. The only committee in which I was involved, I was not involved in any selections, was the membership committee. And as those of you who know about this, members are proposed. There are always fewer women proposed, always, even now. The proportion has been growing. And then the membership elects. When I first joined in 2010, female elections were the success rates were maybe a little lower, maybe the same. Now they are vastly higher. So among the top 30 who are from the whole lot, even though the total proportion is now probably about 33, of the top 30 selected, they're in 1 year, all but one were female, and it's gone to about 70%. So the community out there is aware, and things have changed. And so, you know, even if there is still unconscious bias among some, I'm very happy to see that actually the awareness that women should be promoted, should be made members is there. So, but we still, I'm sure we're still not there, and we'll get to the future in a moment, but there was one more comment from the audience.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment.
Can you say who you are?
Hi,
I know, but
I'm Julia Chmeliak. I'm the reviews editor for a scientific journal here in Cambridge. And my comment is that even though a lot of things have improved 100%, there's a lot of small, subtle things that can be attributed to unconscious bias or even internalized misogyny from other women. Because I've been in situations where, you know, the women in the room were assumed to be a little bit more than the tea ladies. They were assumed to be the ones who will take minutes of a meeting, even to a point where I was recently given a seminar at an institute, and in the afternoon, the PI kind of like assigned to PhD students to give me a guided tour of Yale. Beautiful town, beautiful campus. It so happened that the two PhD students who were babysitting me for the afternoon were the two women PhD students, whereas the dudes were allowed to run their experiments and do their work.
Yeah.
So things are moving, but still, I'm very angry.
Okay,
But actually, so
yes,
maybe
please,
I
please.
wanted to sort of raise a somewhat related issue in thinking about unconscious bias and conscious or discrimination in funding panels and selection committees for jobs and things like this. And this is where I think it's really key that women are represented on these panels who are evaluating careers and evaluating various aspects of our lives. And Liz Blackburn touched on this on what we value and what success, how success is rewarded. And it's super important when you think about funding and that women are more likely to collaborate. We've heard so many talks today about collaborated with this person and I collaborated with that person. And if that woman is not the senior author, it's very easy for funding panels to say, that's not really their work. And so you need voices to speak up on those panels, to say, actually, we should be rewarding collaboration in this collaborative effort because multidisciplinarity is what we want now. And we can't be shooting women down because they collaborate. And so, but that's where getting rid of the unconsciousness and making that an explicit point of discussion in a grant panel or on a selection committee and that sort of thing is absolutely critical. And I think women are more likely to raise those issues. Of course, men will as well.
Yeah.
And educating everybody to have those voices, I think is a key part of keeping the momentum going.
Yeah.
And
Liz, I think it's the educating, not necessarily having women. I mean, I catch myself with unconscious bias. I was at a very high level meeting earlier this year where there were sort of 6 or 7 discussion tables in a room, and at the end one person from each table had to report, you know, and there was the professor from the Institute of Advanced Studies, and there was one from the LSE, and this, that, and the other. Then a person from, I can't remember, Yale or so, got up and gave a beautifully erudite talk about, I can't remember what it was about, but going back into Greek history and Roman history and the whole philosophy about it, and, you know, beautifully. And I caught myself, I'm embarrassed to say it, I caught myself thinking, wow, a Black woman, fantastic. Why? Why did I think that? You know, I just immediately sort of mentally slapped myself. It's really, she was stellar, but I had to sort of, my head put this qualification in. So I don't trust women either. But what does work is training. And there is, especially on funding panels, there is evidence, there's studies that say that even just mentioning it at the beginning of a panel, even if people think they're not biased, helps. Sandra.
And I also agree that it's not necessarily that women have to be on panels, because my experience is that, in fact, I've been personally helped more by men than by women. And in terms of the unconscious bias, I did try to propose, but never went through when I was member of the Equal Opportunity Commission in the University of Geneva, something like measuring the unconscious bias, which can be done through Project Implicit, which is a very, very large study by Harvard University, by psychology and so on. And you can measure your bias, women, career, family, and work, and therefore also screen potential members of committees, women and men, that decide on job promotions and hiring. And basically, it's a conflict of interest. If your brain has been patterned when you grew up in a country which is very patriarchal or has all this bias, you're just unfit to judge. So I think it should be done. And this is something that I've proposed and I will keep proposing, because we all have these biases that come from family and culture and country where you were raised. And this has to be measured, and people who are just obviously not patterned in the right way should be excluded from these committees.
Very drastic proposal. Okay, Kathy. Yeah.
want to make 2 points. Firstly, I'm not going to say who it was because she'll probably be embarrassed, but I recently interviewed someone who said that, I said, do you consider yourself to be a scientist or a woman scientist? And she said, I consider myself to be a scientist until I had children. And then I realized that I was a woman scientist. And she said that, this is recent, this is 2020. There are still men telling her that she can't be serious about her career if she's had children, which I find extraordinary. And she said, not only in this country, but in the US, that people still have gall to say that. It's really quite depressing. The second thing is that I want to put in a plea for part-time work, because people often think that women, if they want to go 4 days a week in their lab because their kids are small or they have parents who can't accept, they're not serious. Can I just point out that most men in senior positions in laboratories and universities throughout the world all have part-time jobs. They don't run their labs full time. They're director of the institute or the chairman of the department. They're all in their labs, maybe for lunch a few days a week. They're not working full time in the lab. And there should be a recognition that part-time is perfectly normal. It's perfectly possible to do really well running a lab part-time. And the fact that you want to be part-time because you want to bring your kids up sometime should be given just as much value as because you want to run a department, sit on it.
Getting some very dramatic
Well,
suggestions.
so-
Absolutely.
so
Yeah, I mean,
microphone is running around.
Yeah,
I-
yeah.
The plug for the flexibility that we have as academics is actually really fantastic, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody is clocking my hours when I come and go. If I have to stay home because my kid is sick, nobody is looking at that.
Yeah.
And so the flexibility that we have actually is, I probably was running a part-time lab when my kid was really little, but I got paid full time and nobody cared, right? As long as I was being productive, it didn't matter.
So we'll take two more over there and then we'll try and, oh God, we have three now. Okay. I'll take you three and then we'll return to trying to talk a little bit about the future, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Sarah Warner in Manchester has worked 4 days a week there since she had kids, and she's been extremely successful, and I'm really pleased that the one that is supporting her in that. So it is possible.
Indeed. Couple over there. Yep. And then I'm going to ask the two young ones here about.
Yeah, I'll follow up on several points.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Hiya. I wanted to make a comment. While we're still thinking about our unconscious bias, I wonder if we can put our energies into using that to reevaluate measures of success. So we have talked about collaboration and that kind of thing, but we also evaluate people on the basis of international speaking, on how well they promote their research, on lots and lots of ways. What type of journal they publish in, obviously. So while we're putting energy into removing as much unconscious bias as possible, I think we should be really reevaluating those measures of success.
Yeah. Because UKRI has just signed the agreement on reforming research assessment, but we can get to that later. Okay, last comment from the audience, and then we'll get back to the panel here.
Thanks very much.
moment.
I find this really enlightening and hearing from, amazing women all day and the past couple of days, but just a final comment about collaboration, because I think it's really important. I've had very different experiences. I've lived in 3 different countries as an academic, and all 3 have been very different. What I will say is that I got a bit gun shy about collaboration. I run a scientific facility. I've been doing that for a very long time. And as we know, scientific facilities often get lost in kind of acknowledgements. And I will say that, my experience, for example, in Belgium was as one of the only women that ran a scientific facility and actually built one from scratch. I was often, in fact, for the 7 years that I was there, left off of any acknowledgement, whereas every single male that ran every facility was acknowledged, to a point where I intellectually contributed quite a bit to a paper, wrote part of the paper, and was then removed as author. So these are things that I find, at least from a perspective of a woman running a scientific facility, I think we need to be more aware of. So it doesn't just happen to women academics or PIs, but it certainly also happens to women running and working in scientific facilities as well.
Thank you for
Thank
that. Thanks for pointing that out. Crass, amazing. But the different cultures are really interesting, and maybe we'll have time to return to that. Yanlan, you're dying to say something.
Yeah, several things now. I've lost track of. We're following up on the part-time thing, right? So I think absolutely. However, the problem is when it comes to assessment, right? So whether it's QQR or the next grant or the next whatever assessment of that person, does the panel really take into account, you know, the so-called lack of productivity because of part-time work? And even as you know, we continue working full-time, but of course I did not work near the amount of full-time as I used to. So you could say I work part-time, but I got paid full-time. Yeah, lucky me. But or you could say, of course, my time available for research, as I said at the beginning, is now shared with other duties. And unfortunately, we do not get extra time, right? Still 24 hours a day. You have to somehow share that amongst whatever. And most of the time, the assessments are at the same time. You know, you have these strict deadlines, which is something else I want to, you know, raise an issue of these 7 years, 15 years, whatever years post PhD, and then you're no longer eligible for whatever grant schemes. Those affect people disproportionately, whether it's caring duties or health issues. I mean, even if you get extensions per whatever reason you come up with, they're never the same. So why have these? Why have these absolute time limits on anything, right? I mean, I understand. So anyway, so I think it's to do with this whole assessment and panels and so on. How can we make this fair? I mean, I know it's hard to quantify, you know, one case against another, but again, maybe having the panels being more aware, more diverse. I mean, I think having